Elias Voronov could hear a spider spin its web. His hearing wasn't a gift. It was his God, his religion, his only reality. He spent millions and years building the perfect room, a space where outside sound ceased to exist. And on the night his neighbor, Anna, choked on her final scream just beyond a thin sheet of drywall, his God was silent. He would later tell the detective, himself, the entire world, that he heard nothing. But in the deafening silence of his perfect apartment, he was beginning to understand. Some things are scarier than a scream. It's the echo you leave behind. 4:30 a.m. San Francisco was still asleep. Elias Vance sat in his soundproof studio, immersed in a ritual that was both sacred and unchanging. His Focal Utopia headphones enveloped his head, transforming it into a receiver tuned to the frequency of the awakening city. On the central monitor, a spectrogram slowly unfurled, a visualization of sounds that most people never even noticed. The low-frequency hum of the first cable car cut through the night's silence at 58 hertz. Elias watched as the green line on the oscilloscope twitched, marking the event. His fingers glided across the keyboard, creating a new folder in his directory. CBLCAR_04_FEB_0430. Save. Archive. Organize. This was his world, a meticulously ordered collection of urban acoustics. The next sound was the distant wail of an ambulance siren, slicing through miles of sleeping streets. Elias closed his eyes, allowing the waves of frequency to wash over his consciousness. To him, this wasn't a cacophony, but a symphony of predictability. The city was waking up on schedule, and every sound took its proper place in an invisible score. The squeal of a garbage truck's brakes, the metallic clang of a dumpster, the muffled thud of a closing door. He cataloged it all. His world remained orderly, controlled, and safe. A ceramic mug of cold green tea sat untouched beside him. The temperature of the drink was irrelevant. Only the acoustics of the moment mattered. The track lighting cast sharp shadows across the graphite acoustic panels that lined the walls. Their pyramidal texture greedily absorbed any echo, turning the studio into a sonic black hole, a sanctuary of pure signal. There were no pictures, photographs, or calendars, nothing to distract from the essential. The sole exception was a framed spectrogram on the far wall, the visual imprint of the final song of an extinct bird. He called it his golden master, tangible proof that sound could outlive death itself. Elias leaned back in his worn leather chair. The material cracked under his weight, emitting a faint squeak. He winced, an extraneous noise in his perfect ecosystem of silence. 3 monitors glowed in the semi-darkness. On the left, the continuous green line of an oscilloscope registered the near-absolute silence of the studio. On the right, a cascade of folders with cryptic names: F_WND_04_BLC, MTL_RES_03_STAIRS, RAIN_JAN_ROOF. Each one was a time capsule, sealed in a digital format. His cables didn't hang in chaotic loops. He had bound them with zip ties and tucked them into channels with manic precision. Elias checked the time on his monitor. 8:01 a.m. Soon the city would be fully awake, and the morning symphony would give way to the chaos of the day. He prepared to conclude his session when 8:03 a.m. A knock. Not from within a recording, from outside. On his door. Elias froze. A series of sharp peaks flared across his central monitor. The visual representation of a crude, percussive intrusion, a dirty sound, unpredictable, an anomaly. A second knock, more insistent this time. Elias slowly removed his headphones. The real world rushed into his ears as a muffled hum, sounds his studio was powerless against. The old building breathed, creaked, and whispered in a language he preferred to ignore. He rose, his felt slippers gliding silently across the floor. But now, without the protection of his headphones, even his own footsteps seemed unnatively loud. A treacherous rustle against the hardwood. A third knock. Elias moved to the door and peered through the peephole. A large man in a rumpled suit stood outside. His face was tired and broad, with a strong jawline. Dark hair, graying at the temples. Brown eyes, ringed by sleepless nights, stared at the door with an air of professional impatience. Elias didn't recognize him. He reluctantly opened the door, leaving the chain lock in place. "Elias Vance?" The man's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like an old engine turning over. "Yes?" "Detective Miller." He flashed a badge, but didn't give Elias time to inspect it. "I need to ask you a few questions." Elias hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to shut the door, to retreat into the safety of his studio and dissolve into the controlled silence. But the detective was already speaking. "It's about your neighbor." Elias unhooked the chain and opened the door wider. Miller stepped inside, and chaos followed him. The smell of damp wool, cheap coffee, and the stale tobacco that clung to his clothes. For Elias's acute sense of smell, it was an assault, but the sounds were even worse. The heavy, arrhythmic thud of soft-soled shoes, the rustle of his suit fabric, the creak of a leather belt. The detective paused in the middle of the entryway, his gaze sweeping over the acoustic panels and the stark, sterile living space. "Interesting place," Miller said, his voice laced with poorly concealed skepticism. Elias remained silent. His fingers found the Zippo lighter in his sweater pocket. Click, snap, click, snap. The rhythm was a small comfort. Elias blinked. Once, then again. Anna. He didn't know her, had never spoken to her, never passed her in the hallway. He always timed his exits to avoid such random encounters. But he knew her sound. The cello. The melancholic sonatas that seeped through the wall on Tuesdays and Thursdays, usually after 9 in the evening. The rich, warm overtones of the strings. Occasionally, a slip into a false note, followed by a long pause and a repeat of the phrase. In his memory, that melody was always alive. Now the word murdered tore into that memory, cutting it short on a sharp, dissonant chord. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" Miller narrowed his eyes. "Yes." Elias heard his own voice, quiet, flat, devoid of inflection. "When was the last time you saw her?" "I don't remember. Maybe a week ago, in the hall." "Did you speak?" "No." Miller pulled out a worn, dog-eared notebook. "You live on the other side of the wall," he stated, not asked. "What did you hear last night?" Elias's mind flashed back instantly. 11:15 p.m. He had put on his best headphones, the Focal Utopia with active noise cancellation. He had loaded a file from the most precious section of his catalog, The Silence of the Mariana Trench, a recording made by a deep-sea hydrophone at a depth of 36,000 feet. Near total silence. He had spent 30 minutes immersed in that void. Should he confess this to the detective? Explain that he had voluntarily shut out reality to listen to a recording of emptiness? Reveal his greatest eccentricity to this coarse man, whose eyes already sized him up as a freak? "Nothing." Elias said the lie quietly but firmly. "Absolutely nothing." The look of bored professionalism vanished from Miller's face, His eyes narrowed, becoming sharp, alive. "Nothing?" he repeated, taking a step forward. The distance between them shrank. Elias instinctively stepped back, his back hitting the wall. "A young, healthy woman is murdered next door," Miller said slowly, enunciating each word. "And you, a sound expert, slept like a baby?" He leaned closer. The smell of coffee became suffocating. "Elias, don't take me for an idiot." "I didn't hear anything," Elias repeated. The lighter in his pocket clicked faster. Open, close, open, close. Miller stared at him for a long moment. The silence stretched, filled with unspoken accusations. "Fine," the detective finally said. "I'll be in touch." He turned and walked out. The door clicked shut. Elias was left alone. The silence returned to the studio, but now it was different. Heavy, ringing, filled with the presence of something unsaid, something hostile. He slowly walked to the west wall, the one separating his apartment from Anna's. He pressed his ear against a panel. Nothing. Only the rush of blood in his ears, the low-frequency hum of his own panic. His greatest gift had betrayed him. Elias pushed himself off the wall and returned to his desk. His hands trembled as he touched the keyboard. There had to be a reason, a technical, logical, explainable reason. He ran a system diagnostic. Microphone check. All 8 units showed perfect sensitivity. Preamplifier check. Frequency response normal. Cable check. Signal path integrity confirmed. Software check. No errors in the logs. Every test returned the same verdict. The system was functioning flawlessly. The fault wasn't in the machine. It was in him. The clock on the monitor showed 11:47 a.m. when Miller returned. He didn't knock this time. He just opened the door. Elias must have forgotten to lock it, and walked in, wearing the expression of a man whose patience had run out. "Anna Caval's time of death was between 11 p.m. and midnight," he said without preamble. "The body shows signs of a struggle. Bruises on her wrists, scratches on her neck." He stopped a few feet from Elias, crossing his arms. "You're sure you were home then?" "Yes." "Doing what?" "Working. Cataloging recordings. And you heard nothing." "That's right." Elias felt each answer tighten a noose around his neck. He averted his gaze, focusing on the oscilloscope. The green line trembled with the vibration of their voices. "All this equipment," Miller said, gesturing around the studio. "What's it for?" "Sound archiving. Restoring old recordings. Sounds complicated." "It is. And you're an expert." "Enough of this crap," Miller snarled directly into Elias's ear. The detective's voice at close range was deafening, its low-frequency overtones resonating inside his skull. "There was a struggle. We found an overturned chair, scuff marks on the floor. The neighbors downstairs heard a muffled thud." Miller gave Elias a slight shake, forcing him to stare at the gray wall. "And you heard nothing?" He released Elias as abruptly as he had grabbed him. Elias staggered, catching his balance by pressing a hand against the wall. The cold of the acoustic panels seeped through his skin. Witnesses who hear nothing quickly become suspects. Miller's voice grew quieter, but more dangerous. Do you understand that, Elias? Elias slowly turned around. He wasn't looking at the detective, but somewhere off to the side, at the empty wall. I understand. Miller watched him for a few more seconds, then sighed heavily and headed for the exit. He paused at the doorway and turned back. You know what the funny part is? His voice sounded almost cheerful, but the cheer was laced with venom. Elias said nothing. Old Mr. Peterson, from the first floor, who can barely hear a thing without his hearing aid, said he caught some kind of thud. Thought someone dropped a sack of potatoes. Miller paused, letting the words sink in. But you, the genius of sound, heard nothing. He left. The door closed with a soft, almost soundless click. Elias could hear his retreating footsteps in the hallway, the creak of the stairs under his weight, the distant slam of the front door downstairs. Then, silence. An absolute, deafening silence. Elias stood in the middle of his perfect studio, surrounded by acoustic panels that were supposed to protect him from the world, but now they had become the walls of a prison, and the silence he had so carefully cultivated over the years had found a voice. The voice of cruel irony. The old man from the first floor, whose hearing aid barely coped with everyday sounds, had heard the echo of a tragedy. But he, Elias Vance, a man whose ears were tuned to catch the whisper of the wind from miles away, a man whose life was dedicated to sound, had heard nothing. Elias walked to his desk and sank into his chair. His gaze fell on the monitor, where the folder from last night was still open. The silence of the Mariana Trench. He clicked on the file, opened the metadata. Start time, 23:15. End time, 23:45. 30 minutes of absolute immersion. 30 minutes of voluntary deafness. 30 minutes during which Anna Koval was dying on the other side of the wall. Elias closed his eyes. A ringing filled his ears, a silence that was louder than any scream. Silence was no longer a refuge. Elias sat in his chair, as still as a statue. The monitors glowed before him, but he stared through them, into nothing. The hum of the equipment, a constant familiar sound at 120 hertz, now seemed like a sinister whisper, as if the machinery itself were discussing his guilt in a language he understood all too well. He closed his eyes and listened. The creak of a floorboard in the hallway. His heart sank. Elias froze, holding his breath. It was a heavy, slow gait, unhurried but relentless. Miller. The detective was outside his door, waiting for the right moment to burst in with new accusations. Elias counted to 20. Silence. No new sounds. He opened his eyes, looked at the door. The lock was secure. The chain was in place. No one. Paranoia. His own brain was generating threats out of the acoustic vacuum. He reached for the keyboard, intending to load an old project, something safe, archival, far from today's nightmare. His fingers hovered over the keys. A muffled voice came through the headphones he had put on an hour ago. Male, low, saying his name. Elias tore the headphones off. Silence. He turned them over in his hands, examining the drivers. Nothing. Just worn-out earpads and perfectly calibrated diaphragms. There was no voice. There couldn't be. The playback file was paused. Phantom sounds. His gift was turning into a curse. The objectivity upon which he had built his life was crumbling under the assault of irrational fear. Elias stood up. His legs were stiff from hours of sitting. He walked to the west wall and pressed his forehead against it. The cold of the acoustic panels seeped through his skin, but offered no relief. A cello used to play behind this wall. Now, there was only a dead silence. The refrigerator was empty. Elias discovered this 3 days after Miller's visit. 3 days spent in the studio without food, without sleep, without contact with the outside world. Just him and his equipment, and a constantly growing sense of being cornered. He had to go out, buy groceries, return to some semblance of a normal life. He pulled on a coat, wrapped a scarf up to his ears, a shield against the harsh sounds of the city. The metal case with his IEMs was a familiar weight in his pocket, a comforting reminder of control. The building's lobby greeted him with dim light and the smell of dampness. Elias was descending to the third-floor landing when he heard footsteps from above. Light, confident, with the distinct rhythm of expensive shoes on marble. Michael Sterling was coming down the stairs. Elias froze. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, return to his apartment, lock himself in. But it was too late. Michael had seen him. "Elias!" His neighbor's voice was a velvety baritone, warm and enveloping. "So good to run into you." He descended a few more steps and stopped beside him. Too close. Elias could smell the expensive cologne, citrus notes with a woody trail. Overpowering. Michael placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. A touch. Elias barely suppressed a shudder. The warm, heavy hand felt like a brand through the fabric of his coat, an invasion of his personal space, a violation of the boundaries he so carefully guarded. "Hang in there," Michael said, squeezing his shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. "I heard how that detective, Miller, was leaning on you. What an unpleasant fellow." Elias looked not at his neighbor's face, but at his throat. There, in the larynx, the sound waves were born. The fundamental frequency was around 110 hertz, with the characteristic overtones of conviction and sympathy. But something was wrong. Looking for a scapegoat to close the case quickly, Michael continued. His blue eyes looked directly into Elias's face with an expression of understanding. "You need a lawyer. A good one. I have contacts." The words were right, the intonations flawless, but there were subtle harmonic distortions that Elias had learned to recognize over years of working with sound. False overtones, an imitation of emotion, not the emotion itself. "Thanks," Elias managed to say, taking a step back. "I have to go." Of course. Michael removed his hand, smiling a wide, charming smile. "If you need anything, I'm on the 5th floor. Always happy to help a neighbor." He walked past, his footsteps receding down the stairs, confident, springy, utterly fearless. Elias stood listening until the sound dissolved completely into the acoustics of the lobby. Was Michael sincere, or was this a subtle game? He couldn't tell. His gift, his perfect pitch, had failed him at the most critical moment. He could no longer distinguish reality from fiction. Night fell over San Francisco like a damp shroud. Elias wandered the deserted streets, enveloped in a wet fog. He had left the grocery bags at home and gone out again, unable to bear the pressure of the soundproof walls any longer. His studio, his sanctuary, had become a cell. Each acoustic panel was a bar on a cage. The city was supposed to be calming. It used to be. Night in San Francisco sounded different, quieter, cleaner, without the chaos of the day. Elias had loved these walks, when the only sounds were his own footsteps and the distant hum of the bay. Now, everything had changed. The swish of tires on wet asphalt sounded like a sinister whisper, filled with menace. The headlights of passing cars seared his eyes, making him cringe and turn away. He walked with his head down, trying to focus on something stable, predictable, his own breathing. Inhale, exhale. Inhale. But even that seemed too loud, too chaotic. He turned into an alley between old apartment buildings. It was darker here, quieter. The walls formed an acoustic tunnel, amplifying and focusing every sound. Elias had walked about 20 yards when he heard footsteps behind him. Measured. Slow. Mimicking his own ragged rhythm. He stopped. The footsteps stopped. His heart began to race, pumping blood into his ears with a pulsating roar. Elias forced himself to take 3 more steps forward, slowly, cautiously. The footsteps behind him resumed, exactly in time. This wasn't an echo. An echo in this space would have a delay of about 0.3 seconds and a characteristic decay. This was a real sound source. A person. Someone was following him. Elias didn't look back. He quickened his pace. The footsteps behind him also sped up. A wave of icy panic washed over him. Miller? Or Anna's killer, deciding to eliminate the only witness? Elias broke into a run. His felt slippers slid on the wet cobblestones. His breath came in ragged gasps. Behind him, the sound of heavy, approaching footsteps. The pursuer was running now, no longer hiding. Elias turned a corner sharply, hoping to lose him, but ran straight into a figure. The impact knocked the wind out of him. They both fell to the wet pavement. Cold water seeped through his coat. Acting on pure instinct, Elias swung his fist. The punch was clumsy, uncoordinated, but it found its mark, something soft. "Hey, man, what the hell?" a frightened young voice cried out. The headlights of a random car illuminated the alley, and Elias saw his pursuer. A kid. A college student, maybe 19, in a hoodie and jeans. He was holding a hand to his split lip from which blood was trickling. In his other hand, he clutched an old leather wallet. Elias's wallet. "You dropped this by the store," the kid said, holding out the wallet with a trembling hand. "I was running after you to give it back." "Damn, are you crazy?" Elias looked at the wallet, then at the blood on the student's lip, then at his own hands smeared with dirt and asphalt. He had attacked an innocent person. His paranoia, his heightened sense of hearing, his inability to distinguish a real threat from a fabricated one had brought him to this. He had become dangerous, not just to himself, but to others. "I'm sorry," Elias stammered, getting to his feet. I'm sorry." The kid snatched the wallet, tossed it at Elias, and quickly walked away, glancing back over his shoulder with a look of fear and disgust. Elias was left alone in the alley, in the drizzling rain, humiliated, broken, devastated. The apartment greeted him with a dead silence. Elias shed his wet coat, pulled off his soaked slippers. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from adrenaline and residual terror. He could no longer trust his senses. His hearing, his greatest gift, had betrayed him. His intuition was a liar. He couldn't tell the sound of a threat from the sound of help. The only thing left was the data. Cold, objective, dispassionate numbers and spectrograms that didn't lie, panic, or distort reality. Elias walked into his studio and sank into his chair. The leather creaked under his weight, a familiar, almost comforting sound. He ran his hands over his face, gathering his thoughts. The plan was simple. Stop panicking. Start a systematic analysis. He would open the multi-channel audio files recorded by his system on the night of Anna's murder. Analyze every millisecond, every decibel, every frequency. He would either find proof of his innocence or confirmation of his madness. But at least there would be truth. Elias touched the keyboard. The monitors sprang to life, filling with program windows and file trees. He found the folder he needed, 04_FEB_2026_night. 8 files, one from each of his system's microphones, a continuous recording from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. He loaded the first file into his audio editor. A spectrogram unfurled across the screen, a visualization of that night's soundscape. Elias began listening at high speed. The hum of the ventilation, the distant bark of a dog, the creak of his own floorboards as he moved between rooms. The sounds were mundane, familiar, safe. 10:47 p.m. Nothing. 10:58 p.m. Nothing. 11:15 p.m. The moment he had put on his headphones and submerged himself in the silence of the Mariana Trench. The spectrogram showed no anomalies. The background noise dropped to a minimum. The system was working, but nothing was happening outside. Or was it? And his microphones just hadn't picked it up. He scrolled to 11:30 p.m., then to 11:45 p.m., scanning the tracks with manic intensity, searching for anything unusual. And then he found it. 11:47:13 p.m. A series of short, sharp impulses, 7 of them. Rhythmic, mechanical, with a precise interval of 0.8 seconds between each one. Elias froze. He zoomed in on the fragment, isolated the sound, and played it back at low volume. Click, pause, click, pause, click. His heart began to beat faster. This was it, an anomaly, something that shouldn't be in his catalog of ordinary night sounds. It didn't sound like anything familiar. A lock being picked? A secret signal? The sound of some kind of mechanism? Elias felt a flicker of hope, almost extinguished after the shameful incident in the alley, reignite in his chest. A small spark, but it was alive. He saved the fragment as a separate file and began his analysis. A day passed. Elias didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He worked. He isolated the 7 clicks, ran them through a spectral analyzer, and built a sonogram. The frequency response showed a peak in the 2 to 4 kilohertz range with a characteristic drop-off in the higher frequencies. Metal? Plastic? Wood? He compared the sound to thousands of samples from his library, different types of lock mechanisms, light switches, household appliances, construction tools. Nothing was a perfect match. Elias started forming theories. Maybe it was a rare type of lockpick? Or an electronic device used to jam an alarm system. He could already picture himself presenting this finding to Miller, seeing the look of astonishment on the detective's gruff face. Here is your clue. Here is your real culprit. But first, he needed absolute certainty. Elias decided to rule out all possible sound sources from within his own apartment. He cataloged everything: the refrigerator, the ventilation, the plumbing, the heating. At the last moment, almost as an afterthought, he loaded the sound into a household appliance simulation program, an old utility he used for identifying background noises. He clicked Analyze. The program ran for 3 seconds. The result appeared on the screen. Match: 98.7%. Source: Electromagnetic Relay, Model RP21, manufactured 1987 to 1995. Typical application: refrigerator compressors, vintage models. A knock at the door shattered the silence. Sharp, demanding, authoritative. Elias didn't even have time to get out of his chair before the door flew open from a powerful kick. The lock gave way. The chain snapped with a faint jingle. Miller burst into the apartment. Behind him were two uniformed officers, the elderly neighbor from the first floor and the perpetually disgruntled building superintendent. Witnesses. "Search warrant, Elias," the detective said, holding out a piece of paper without waiting for a response. His men were already moving through the apartment. Rough, latex-gloved hands opened cabinets, rifled through stacks of papers, and searched drawers. "You have no right," Elias began, but his voice sounded weak even to his own ears. "I do," Miller cut him off. "Read the warrant." One of the officers entered the studio. His heavy boots left dirty footprints on the floor. He began to methodically inspect the equipment, touching the microphones, checking the wires. Elias lunged forward. "Don't touch that! It's fragile!" Miller intercepted him, pushing him against the wall. "Don't interfere with the investigation." Elias watched helpless as they dismantled his world. The second officer opened a shelf of archival reels, rare recordings Elias had spent decades collecting. He carelessly swept several of them aside to check behind them. The reels clattered to the floor. "Be careful!" Elias shouted. No one paid him any mind. The search lasted 40 minutes. 40 minutes during which strangers desecrated his sanctuary. They touched his things with their dirty hands. They disrupted the order he had spent years creating. They brought chaos into his perfectly ordered world. They found nothing. Of course they found nothing. There was nothing criminal there. Only sounds, only silence, only his life. "Clear," one of the officers reported to Miller. The detective nodded. He gave Elias a long, appraising look. "Clear for now," he said. "But we'll be back." They left, leaving the door hanging wide open. Elias stood in the middle of his ransacked studio. Wires dangled from his desk. Reels of tape lay scattered on the floor. Stacks of paper were strewn about, mixed up, tainted by foreign hands. Dirty boot prints marred the immaculate cleanliness of his floor. Chaos. But instead of despair, Elias felt something else. A cold, crystalline rage. He had been humiliated. His world had been shattered. His silence had been defiled. The passive search was over. Now, it was personal. Elias slowly knelt and began to gather the scattered reels, one by one, methodically, carefully. Each one was returned to its proper place on the shelf. He would no longer defend himself. He would attack. He would find the truth, not to justify himself to Miller, but for himself, for Anna, to take revenge on the one who had destroyed his silence and turned his life into this nightmare. Elias picked up the last reel and clutched it to his chest. And in the absolute silence of his ruined studio, he made a decision. Silence had become his ally. Elias stood amidst the chaos the police had left behind, but instead of despair, he felt a strange calm. A cold resolve crystallized from rage. His paranoia, his fear, had compressed into a single sharp point. Focus. He knelt and picked up the first reel. Wind_NOV_1987. He gently wiped the dust from it and returned it to the shelf, precisely in its place. Each movement was a ritual. Not just cleaning up, but restoring order to a world they had tried to destroy. Reclaiming control. For 2 hours, Elias worked with surgical precision, arranging his studio until it was immaculate once more. But he had changed. He was no longer a cornered victim. He was an expert whose sanctuary had been desecrated. And he would prove his case, not for Miller or the police, but for himself. for Anna. He opened his laptop and launched a terminal. His fingers flew across the keyboard, writing line after line of a complex Python script. It would simultaneously analyze all 8 channels of the recording, cross-referencing them against a database of 15,000 anomalous sounds, searching for ghosts in the machine. For 3 hours, he worked without a break. When he finally ran the program, his screen came alive with a cascade of windows, graphs, and spectrograms. For the first time in days, he felt something akin to control. He put on his Sennheiser HD 800 headphones, closed his eyes, and pressed play. The soundscape of the night of the murder unfolded before him. He worked like an archaeologist, peeling back layers of sound. The hum of the refrigerator, removed. The distant noise of the city, filtered. The creak of the pipes, cleaned. Each filter revealed a new level of silence. On his monitors, the spectrograms faded, becoming cleaner, approaching the perfect horizontal line of absolute silence. He was completely focused. Hope was no longer an abstract concept. It was real, tangible, growing with every frequency he filtered. He would find a clue. He had to. 11:42:17 p.m. He replayed the recording again, focusing on the time between 11 p.m. and midnight. He applied another high-frequency filter, removing electromagnetic interference. And suddenly, he heard it. Not on the recording, in his own head. A quiet, melancholic melody, painfully familiar. Anna had played it often, something by Bach, the cello Suite No. 1. Elias froze. His heart skipped a beat. The melody continued to play, rich and warm. He tore off the headphones. The melody didn't disappear. It continued inside his skull, as if someone had hidden an invisible speaker inside his brain. "No," Elias whispered. "No, no, no." He stood up, pacing the studio, pressing his palms to his ears to block the phantom sound. But the cello played on. Auditory hallucination, a product of an exhausted nervous system and overwhelming guilt. He leaned his forehead against the west wall, the one that separated his apartment from Anna's. Cold acoustic panels, dead silence behind them. But in his head, the cello played on and on. He slid down the wall to the floor, his breath quickening, his hands trembling. The fear returned, not the paranoid fear of being followed, but a deep, existential dread. He was losing his ability to distinguish real sound from imaginary. His greatest gift was becoming a curse, destroying him from within. The melody slowly faded, dissolving into the silence of the studio. Elias sat on the floor, listening to the only real sound in that moment. His own breathing. Dead silence behind them. But in his head, the cello played on. He slid down the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands trembling. The fear returned, not the paranoid fear of being followed, but a deep, existential dread. He was losing the ability to distinguish real sound from imaginary. His greatest gift was becoming a curse, destroying him from within. The melody slowly faded, dissolving into the silence of the studio. Elias sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, listening to his own breathing. the only real sound in that moment. A floor above, in his sterile apartment, Michael Sterling stood at a panoramic window, looking out at the San Francisco night. The city lay below like a map traced in light. He held a glass of wine, an expensive Burgundy that most people couldn't afford. He took a sip, assessing the bouquet with the practiced precision of a sommelier. But his thoughts were not on the wine. The light in Elias's apartment had been on for the third night in a row. Michael could hear it. Through the old hardwood floors and ventilation shafts, the muffled sounds of activity. Footsteps, the creak of a chair, the hum of equipment. This strange, quiet neighbor wasn't giving up. Michael was not accustomed to such variables. People were usually predictable. Miller was looking for simple answers. The police followed protocol. But Elias was an anomaly. Michael set the glass down on the table. The sound was quiet, controlled. He never made unnecessary noise. Passive observation was no longer enough. It was time to act. The next day, at precisely 2:30 p.m., Elias left his apartment. Michael knew his schedule. Elias was meticulous to the point of absurdity. Every day at the same time, he walked to the corner store for groceries. 20 minutes, round trip. No more, no less. Michael waited until the sound of Elias's footsteps had completely faded in the lobby. He took a thin leather case from his pocket, opening it to reveal a set of professional lockpicks. It was one of his many hidden talents, a skill acquired out of curiosity and honed to perfection through sheer perfectionism. He descended to the 4th floor and stopped in front of Elias's door. He listened. Silence. He selected 2 picks and inserted them into the lock. He worked confidently, without haste. The mechanism yielded in 40 seconds. A click. The door opened. Michael slipped into the apartment. The smell of ozone from the running equipment, the cold of metal surfaces, a sterility that bordered on madness. He walked into the studio and looked at the monitors, frozen with spectrograms. He observed the neatly arranged tools, the perfect order that verged on obsession. Michael smiled. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and took out an object he had kept as a trophy, Anna's broken cello string. He had taken it that night, after it was all over. Not out of sentimentality. Michael was incapable of such emotions, but from a sense of ownership. It was his prize, proof of his superiority. He carefully placed the string on Elias's mixing console, right in the center of the impeccably clean surface. The message was clear. He turned and, as silently as he had entered, left the apartment. The lock clicked shut with a barely audible sound. Elias returned home with 2 bags of groceries. He walked up the stairs, unlocked his apartment door, and froze on the threshold. Something was wrong. Not visually, not physically, but the atmosphere had changed. The air felt alien, as if someone had disturbed the very molecular structure of the space. He walked slowly into the studio. The bags dropped from his hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. On the mixing console, on the flawless surface of his sanctuary, lay a cello string. Dark, broken, coiled like a snake. Elias bolted down the stairs, leaping over steps, nearly falling, grabbing the railing for support. He caught up with his neighbor on the third floor. Michael stopped and turned, that same charming smile playing on his lips. His light blue eyes watched with an expression of curiosity. "It was you," Elias breathed. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. In that instant, all the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Michael's charm, his questions about Miller, his too perfect appearance, the false overtones in his voice. Michael tilted his head slightly, feigning confusion. "I don't know what you're talking about, Elias." His voice was soft, calming, but his eyes remained cold. The lie, the composure. Elias snapped. He lunged forward, swinging a fist. The punch was clumsy, desperate, born of rage rather than skill. Michael sidestepped it easily. His hand shot out, striking Elias in the chest with an open palm. The shove was precise, calculated. Elias stumbled back, his back hitting the wall. The air rushed out of his lungs. Michael stepped forward. His smile vanished, leaving his face utterly blank. Cold. Predatory. He leaned in close to Elias, his breath hot against his ear. "You're playing a game whose rules you don't understand," he hissed, his voice a low whisper. Then he straightened up, the smile returning to his face as if he had put on a mask. "Take care of yourself, Elias." Michael turned and calmly continued down the stairs. His footsteps receded, confident, springy, utterly fearless. Elias remained leaning against the wall, a tremor running through his body. Adrenaline coursed through his blood, but with it came a realization. The fear was gone. There was only rage, pure, focused, all-consuming. The threat now had a face. The face of Michael Sterling. He returned to his apartment and closed the door, leaning against it, trying to calm his breathing. His mind was racing. He knew who the killer was. But he had no proof. The police wouldn't believe him. Miller would laugh in his face. He needed something irrefutable. He walked into the studio, bypassing the mixing console and the cello string. He sank into his chair and looked at the monitors. The answer was here, in the recordings, in the sounds, in the silence of that night. He had missed something of his own. He opened a new file on his laptop, his digital work journal, a meticulous minute-by-minute record of his actions that he had kept for years, his obsession with order taken to an absurd extreme. But now, it might save him. He scrolled through the journal to February 4th, 2026, to the night of Anna's murder. The entries were detailed. 8:15 p.m., dinner, reheated soup. 9:00 p.m., working on the restoration of a 1963 film reel. 10:30 p.m., calibrating microphone number 3. 11:00 p.m. Elias stopped. He read the next line. Then he read it again, and again. 11:15 p.m. to 11:45 p.m. Listening session. The silence of the Mariana Trench. Headphones. Focal Utopia NC. Active noise canceling. 30 minutes. Exactly during the time Anna was dying next door. All the rage, the adrenaline, the hope. It all evaporated in an instant, leaving behind a cold, deafening void. He stared at the screen, the words blurring. He hadn't missed Anna's screams because of a technical failure, not because of the killer's skill. He himself, with his own 2 hands, had put on the world's best noise-canceling headphones. He had loaded a recording of perfect silence from the bottom of the ocean. He had disconnected from the world. He had chosen his obsession over her life. Elias leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked, a familiar sound that now seemed like a mockery. The studio was completely silent, but in his head there was a deafening roar. The roar of realization, the roar of guilt, the roar of the very scream he had never heard. Silence was no longer empty. It was filled with his failure. A sharp ring from the telephone shattered the silence. Elias flinched. He opened his eyes and looked at the old landline on the corner of his desk, a relic he kept for important calls. It rang again, demanding, relentless. Elias reached out and lifted the receiver. Yes. Elias? Miller's voice was tired but final. The game is over. A pause. I'll expect you at the station tomorrow at 10:00 hours. Pack a bag, if you know what I mean. It wasn't a request. It was a summons to surrender. I understand, Elias forced out. A dial tone. He slowly replaced the receiver. He looked at the clock on the monitor. 2:17 a.m. In 7 hours and 43 minutes, he was supposed to turn himself in, to admit defeat, to accept the blame for a crime he didn't commit, but had enabled through his own choices. The trap had snapped shut. A floor above, Michael Sterling stood at his panoramic window. The city lay below, a sea of lights slowly dimming in the pre-dawn haze. He held a glass of mineral water. Wine wasn't right for tonight. Tonight required absolute clarity of mind. His gaze drifted down to the windows of the building across the way. The light in Elias's apartment was still on. Michael had watched earlier as Miller's car pulled up. He had seen the detective enter the building. 20 minutes later, he came out, got in his car, and drove away. Elias hadn't been arrested. Not yet. But the light in his window burned on, for the third night in a row. The obsessive archivist wasn't sleeping, wasn't resting, was still searching. Michael took a sip of water. The cold liquid was refreshing. He was a risk analyst. His job was to evaluate variables, calculate probabilities, and make rational decisions. Elias Vance was an unpredictable variable. The police had found nothing. There was no evidence. But this strange man kept digging. The risk was too great. The variable had to be eliminated. Tonight, 3:47 a.m. The building was asleep. Even the neighbor's dog on the second floor was quiet. Michael, dressed in black track pants and a black turtleneck, silently descended the stairs to the 4th floor. In his pocket was the thin leather case with his lockpicks. In the other, a pair of thin leather gloves. He stopped in front of Elias's door and listened. Silence. No, not quite. The faint hum of running equipment. Elias was still inside. He pulled on the gloves, took out the picks, inserted them into the lock. He worked with calm confidence. 40 seconds. A click. The door opened. Michael slipped inside, closing the door so quietly it was as if it had never been opened. He moved through the apartment with the grace of a predator, each step silent and precise. He rounded the hallway and approached the studio. The door was ajar. Inside, the cold light of the monitors cast long shadows. Elias was sitting in his chair with his back to the entrance, staring motionlessly at the screens. Michael paused in the doorway, observing, savoring the moment of absolute superiority. Then he entered. Looking for something, Elias? The velvety voice cut through the silence. Elias spun around, the chair groaning under his weight. Michael stood 10 feet away, relaxed, smiling, but his eyes were empty, cold. You! Michael lunged before Elias could scream. The move was professional. One hand clamped over Elias's mouth while the other grabbed his throat, yanking him from the chair. Elias struggled, but Michael was far stronger. He hurled the archivist across the room. Elias crashed into a shelving unit. Reels of tape rained down, scattering across the floor. Michael advanced slowly, the smile never leaving his face. "Go ahead and scream, Elias," he said softly. "Scream your lungs out." He gestured to the acoustic panels on the walls. "You worked so hard to create the perfect silence. The irony is, you've built yourself the perfect tomb." Elias tried to get up. Michael kicked him in the chest. The air rushed out of his lungs. "No one will hear you," Michael continued, leaning down. "Just like no one heard Anna." He grabbed Elias by the sweater, lifted him, and threw him to the middle of the floor. Elias tried to crawl toward the door. Michael stepped on his hand. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud. A scream tore from Elias's throat. Michael laughed. A quiet, satisfied sound. "See? No one is coming." Michael pinned Elias to the floor, his hands closing around his throat. The pressure mounted. Air ceased to flow. Elias choked, clawing at Michael's hands, trying to break free. It was useless. His vision began to darken. His pulse hammered in his ears like a deafening drum. He saw Michael's face above him, triumphant, calm, utterly vacant. This was the end. But in that moment, on the edge of consciousness, his gaze fell upon his workstation, the control console, the keyboard, his world. And in his oxygen-starved brain, a desperate thought was born. A final, insane plan. Elias stopped struggling. Michael felt the body beneath him go limp. "That's better," he whispered. But then Elias made an unpredictable move. Not backward, trying to escape, but forward and to the side, toward the desk. His right arm broke free, reaching for the keyboard. Michael sneered. "Trying to make a call?" he mocked. Elias's fingers found the keys. He pressed the combination. F7, enter. Nothing happened. Michael tightened his grip. "It's pointless, Elias. Just—" He stopped. He abruptly released Elias's throat and clutched his own head. The room began to swim. There was no sound. To the human ear, it was absolute silence. But to the body, it was torture. Elias had activated the file Calibration LF Max, a recording of pure infrasound at 19 Hz pushed to maximum power through subwoofers hidden in the walls. The inaudible wave crashed over Michael. His vestibular system went haywire. His sense of balance vanished. The room spun, the walls warped, the floor turned to liquid. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. His heart hammered against his ribs as a wave of nausea and irrational, animalistic terror washed over him. He didn't understand what was happening. There was only pure, absolute fear. Breathing heavily, Elias staggered to his feet. His throat burned, and his broken hand throbbed with pain, but he was standing. He looked down at his vanquished foe. Michael, the physically perfect predator, the man of absolute control, was writhing on the floor, defeated by an invisible, inaudible weapon. Elias reached for the keyboard and hit escape. The infrasound stopped. The silence that returned was different now. Michael lay on the floor, trembling, his face pale and his breathing ragged. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey. Elias walked past him and sat down in his chair, turning to the monitors. His fingers, despite the pain in his broken hand, glided over the keyboard. His left hand was enough. He opened the file. The silence of the Mariana Trench. He applied a series of filters, a narrow band filter focused on the frequency of a human whisper, a 40 decibel gain, low frequency suppression, dynamic range compression. The spectrogram on the screen began to change. The near-total silence of the deep-sea recording began to take shape. And there it was, 23:37:42. A voice emerged from the background of silence. Quiet, barely perceptible, but clear. It was Michael's voice, muttering at the moment of the murder. "Mine. You will be mine, Anna." Elias hit pause. He looked at Michael, still lying on the floor. "You were right," Elias said quietly. "I built the perfect tomb, but not for myself. For your voice." At that moment, the apartment door burst open from the force of a kick. The wood splintered, the lock torn from the frame. Miller stormed into the studio with 2 officers, guns drawn. He froze in the doorway. The scene before him was surreal. On the floor was Michael Sterling, the successful analyst with a perfect reputation, crumpled and shaking. At the desk sat Elias Vance, calm and focused, his throat bruised and his arm clearly broken. "Detective Miller," Elias said without turning. "I think you should hear this." He pressed play. The room filled with a quiet but distinct whisper. "Mine. You will be mine, Anna." Miller stared at Michael, then at Elias, then back at Michael. "Take him," he ordered the officers. 3 weeks later, Elias sat in his restored studio. The reels were back on their shelves. The wires were neatly tucked away. Order had been re-established. But something had changed. The west wall no longer felt like a barrier. The yellow police tape had been removed from Anna's door. The apartment was sealed, awaiting her relatives. Sometimes, late at night, Elias would listen to the silence behind the wall. And it was no longer empty. It was filled with a presence, not a ghost, but a memory. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it. Miller was standing on the threshold, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. "May I?" Elias nodded, stepping aside. Miller walked into the studio and looked around. Everything was, as usual, impeccable. But he noticed one new detail. On the wall, next to the spectrogram of the extinct bird, hung a new frame. Inside was a newspaper photo of Anna with her cello. Miller handed Elias a cup of coffee. "Sterling confessed," he said, "to everything. His lawyers are trying for temporary insanity, but..." He shook his head. "Your recording. Forensics confirmed it's authentic." Miller handed Elias a cup of coffee. "Sterling confessed," he said, "to everything. His lawyers are trying for temporary insanity, but..." He shook his head. "Your recording. Forensics confirmed it's authentic." Elias picked them up, turning them over in his hands. For the first time, a slight, confident smile touched his lips. "Just cataloging a new specimen for my collection," he replied. "Anything interesting?" Elias glanced at his monitor, where a new folder was open. Justice_FEB_2026. It turns out justice has a very specific frequency. Miller chuckled, a short bark-like sound. "Specific, you say?" 19 hertz, Elias answered. Inaudible to the ear, but utterly devastating to anyone who believes they are above consequences. The detective finished his coffee and crumpled the cup in his hand. "Take care of yourself, Elias." He turned and walked toward the door, then paused. "If you need anything, call me. You never know." "Thank you, Detective." Miller left. The door closed quietly. Elias was alone again in his studio. He walked to the west wall and placed his palm against the cool acoustic panels. "I'm sorry, Anna," he whispered into the silence. The silence didn't answer, but it was no longer hostile. Elias returned to his desk. He put on his headphones and opened a new project. The file was named Catalog of Disappearing Sounds, Volume 47, Voices. He pressed record. And in the absolute silence of his studio, Elias Vance began his work anew. But now he wasn't listening to escape the world. He was listening to preserve it.